Thank you, Fred. There are two people on the panel who know a lot more about coal than I do. Nonetheless, let me give you my perspective on where coal is and where I think it's going. And as you know, it hasn't been an easy time for the coal industry for a variety of reasons, and I'm going to touch on some of those. We've seen dozens of coal companies file for bankruptcy over the past decade. This was just a week ago. Coal firm called Armstrong filed for bankruptcy. And at the same time, I don't know the exact number, but I do know that more than 100 coal-fired power plants have been closed over the past decade. Maybe it's closer to 200. In fact, we are planning to shut down 3 huge coal plants in the state of Texas next year with combined capacity of about 4 gigawatts. That's pretty significant. And we also have 18 gigawatts of 18 gigawatts of wind power in Texas, which nobody knows about, including most people in Texas. We are by far the #1 wind state, which has its positive side and has its negative side, and I'm going to touch on some of that. Anyhow, here's just a picture of one closed coal mining site in Kentucky. Maybe you know which one this is. I just found this picture on the internet. President Trump says he wants to save the coal industry, bring back coal jobs. And he may be able to save the coal industry, but I don't think we're going to bring back a lot of coal jobs. In the 1930s, there were more than 850,000 people working in coal mines. And today, well, I think that says 81,000. I think it's closer to 60, 65,000 today. Most of those job losses, if you want to call them job losses, are not related to regulation. They're not related to cheap natural gas. They're a result of automation. You don't have guys with picks going into coal mines anymore. You have guys with these huge pneumatic drills. And the productivity of the coal industry has increased just dramatically over the last 20 years. So we produce a lot more coal per worker than we used to. So this is a kind of a typical coal mine in Appalachia. And then, of course, we've got open pit coal mining in the West. That's a different animal in terms of the way it's mined. A lot fewer people required relative to the amount that's produced. You take a big backhoe and put the stuff in these huge trucks. We also out west have a couple of these facilities where coal-fired generating plants are literally located right next to the mine. These are called the mine mount plants. They're very, very efficient. The cheapest electricity in the country comes from these types of coal-fired generators because the transportation costs are very, very low. The cost of installing the conveyor belts. So coal has a number of problems or challenges. Coal is dirty. Well, I mean, it's dirty on a lot of different scales. Everybody talks about the CO2 content, the carbon footprint. They argue, natural gas has half the carbon footprint of coal. And, I don't want to get into the debate. We heard earlier today about, CO2 is good for the planet, it's not bad for the planet, but nonetheless, one of the perceptions about why coal is going away is because it's dirty. Clearly, there's been a lot of regulation aimed at the coal industry over the past decade. That's another factor that's helped speed up the demise of some coal companies. But I think natural gas, cheap and abundant natural gas is the primary reason that coal has been going away in terms of domestic power generation. I think Fred mentioned we've gone from about 60% to 32, 33% over the last 15 years. Last year, for the first time, we generated more electricity with natural gas than we did with coal. So you can see the crossover on this slide. So the Clean Power Plan is on hold, or it's been repealed. I'm not exactly sure what the legal status is. This was a study done by the Department of Energy saying, well, what if the Clean Power Plan goes away? Will that extend the life of coal-fired generating plants? What will that do in terms of coal production? And if you just look at the top line here, basically the conclusion of the Energy Information Administration was if the clean power plant goes away, that will kind of maintain a steady state in terms of U.S. coal production, because a number of plants that would otherwise have been shuttered will stay on stream, at least for the remainder of their useful life. Now, I haven't heard any utility executives talk about building a new coal-fired power plant. And maybe my colleagues have a different view on that. But I think even with the clean power plant going away, it's highly unlikely that we're going to see any new coal-fired power plant constructed. And I stand to be corrected, but at least that's my impression. We've heard a lot of talk about clean coal, and there have been a couple of demonstration projects. This one in particular, the Kemper clean coal plant in Mississippi. You talk about nuclear plants having cost overruns. The cost overrun on this facility was astronomical. There was a huge federal subsidy involved in constructing this plant. The idea was to convert coal to natural gas, capture and sequester the carbon. It got so expensive that several months ago, I think it's the Southern Company, Southern Company, which is building this plant, said, I'm sorry guys, we just can't make this work. This is going to be a straight gas plant. So we have a huge gas plant that's being added to the grid. But this project, it just didn't work. It just didn't prove to be, cost effective. Now there have been some other coal capture experiments that have been successful. And this is a plant in South Texas. It's a medium-sized plant. It's called the Parish Coal Plant, and they are capturing the CO2. They're not sequestering it, they're putting it into a pipeline and sending it down to the Eagle Ford shale play, where the CO2 is being used for secondary recovery. So, there are some cost-effective ways of capturing carbon if you have a market for that CO2. And as I said, this plant is located fairly close to the field where oil and gas is being produced. There was a demand for CO2 that they could provide from this plant. And there have been a number of other facilities like this around the country and in other countries. But it's not really a big deal. I don't put a lot of faith in coal capture and sequestration. Again, these guys know more about it than I, and maybe they have a different perspective. So as coal demand levels off in the United States, that's not the case in the rest of the world, or in many parts of the rest of the world. If you look at the global demand growth for coal between 1993 and 2013, you can see it was up about 50–60%, with a lot of that growth in demand coming from China. And that demand is going to continue to grow. This chart comes from our own U.S. Energy Department, and when they look into their crystal ball at where the planet's electricity is going to come from down the road, up to the year 2040, coal, the growth of coal is going to continue, admittedly at a slower pace, but 23 years from now, coal is still going to be the number one or number two provider of electricity around the world. We do see some growth in renewables. We see significant growth in natural gas. They're actually looking at growth in nuclear around the world, although we're not seeing any here. So the point is that coal demand worldwide is high and it's growing and will continue to grow at least until the year 2040. And I think that may be the best opportunity for the U.S. coal industry. Our exports right now are fairly small, but we do export coal, mainly from the East Coast. It's mainly Appalachian coal. And this shows you the largest coal ports in the U.S., the biggest One is Newport News, Virginia. Baltimore's pretty big, and then you've got a couple along the Texas, Louisiana Gulf Coast, and there is one in San Francisco Bay, but it's not carrying a lot of freight right now. In fact, I want to talk about the importance or the need to develop our coal export infrastructure if we're going to become a growing player in the global coal market. And we heard Joe's talk this morning about coal and the potential to ship Western coal to Asia, which is where the biggest demand growth is going to be, but we just don't have the capacity right now. So this is the largest one in the U.S. Serving the Appalachian coal exports, and that's in Newport News, Virginia. This facility in the Port of Oakland has filed for permits to expand, and they just can't get the permits approved because the environmentalists are pushing back, have been pushing back. So the expansion of this facility has been put on hold. There have been recent proposals to build coal export terminals in the state of Washington and in the state of Oregon. Pushback in both of those states from the governor on down. Environmental groups are very, very active in those states, and they don't want us exporting coal. When they say, well, it's the train traffic, it's the coal dust, that's all nonsense. It's just part of the anti-carbon agenda. And the idea is that we don't want to export coal because that means we'll be producing more coal, bad for the planet, end of story. So I don't know what's going to happen. I think it's absolutely critical to have facilities where we can export our Western coal to the growing markets. And I don't know what the federal government can do to push back against the states. We'll just have to wait and see. There are a couple of options. I mean, you could ship Western coal through Mexico. You could ship it through Vancouver. The Port of Vancouver has a coal loading facility. So maybe, that's one of the alternatives. It's not all bad news for the coal industry. I was really surprised to see that year over year in the U.S., coal production is up. And I think that has come about mainly because of the drop in the value of the dollar, which has made U.S. coal a lot cheaper. I mean, 7 or 8% cheaper than it was a year earlier. So to kind of summarize, I really think we need to be focusing on exports as the best medium-term option, certainly, for the domestic coal industry. There's another issue related to coal that we've heard about, and I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about, not just in the coming months, but maybe in the coming years. And that's this whole issue of grid reliability or grid resiliency. As Fred mentioned, if we're 30% coal and we're 20% nuclear, 50% of the nation's electricity is coming from these baseload power plants that are always on, or at least it's supposed to be always on. Although here in Texas, with all this wind, sometimes we have to shut off our baseload coal plants because, in essence, wind gets first dibs into the grid. And why wouldn't it if they're selling at negative rates? So grid reliability, I think, is an important issue in Texas, and it's an important issue nationally. And it has to do with the intermittency of renewables, volatility of natural gas prices, and as well as uncertainty about the future of nuclear. So as I'm sure you know, several weeks ago, Secretary of Energy Perry proposed a resiliency charge, or something to that effect. Let's just call it subsidies, provide subsidies to coal and nuclear to compensate them for grid resiliency. We've been talking about that in Texas for a number of years. We're an all-energy state. We're totally deregulated, all merchant power generators. So there's been talk in Texas about a capacity charge. So I don't really have a position on that, but I do think grid reliability is an issue, and I think the really tough challenge for groups represented in this audience is if you think grid reliability is important enough to subsidize or provide some kind of benefits to nuclear and coal, it's pretty hard to make the argument at the same time that we should do away with subsidies for renewables. So That's the coal world as I see it today, and thanks for your attention.